First, perhaps this is the first you've heard of our young think tank, the Center of Journalism and Liberty, which is part of the Knight Research Network that kicked off last summer. I came aboard in March, and now we're releasing our first major works. Our focus is on policy regulation and enforcement in 4 areas: platforms, privacy, business models, and content quality and integrity. This particular paper we'll be talking about today bends in, of course, business models, and you can't have quality content without reputable news organizations covering communities. This is the kind of idea we want our think tank to foster, to build a brighter policy-powered future for the Fourth Estate. If you're tossing around any ideas with a friend or have one to bounce off around with us, please get in touch. We're starting to formulate our action plan for the second year of our grant. And we're looking for smart papers, smart contributors in the form of freelancers or fellows, both professionals and scholars. In fact, this paper stems from the buddy system. The troubles facing journalism got 2 old friends talking about COVID this spring. Steve Waldman and our managing director, Phil Longman, long ago worked at US News and World Report together. And Steve earlier in his career worked for Washington Monthly, where now Phil serves as a senior editor. Small world as we know it. And this paper stems from their conversation when a whole bunch of ideas were being shared about how to help news organizations with the devastating impact of COVID. And his view is shaped by many of the people on this call, not only on the panel. So that's what we'll be hearing about today. And how we'll proceed, I'll give brief introductions and direct you to the link in the chat already, so you can scan Steve's paper and start sharing questions in the chat box. We'll open with Steve reviewing his proposal and then transition to Fraser Nelson to talk about the conversion to nonprofit status of the Salt Lake Tribune. And then next, Denise Rolark-Barnes will address the plight and value of and the shaky future of ethnic weekly media. Then we'll turn to Elizabeth Hansen and Mark Hand, who've crafted a similar proposal. As you probably are aware, in brief, Steve Waldman has a day job as CEO and co-founder of Report for America, and his earlier work with the FCC has sharpened his policy smarts, which he shares in this paper. And Fraser Nelson joins us from out west, where she's VP of Innovation with the Salt Lake Tribune. And that's a shining example of a successful replanting to nonprofit status. Also joining us is Denise Rolark-Barnes, who's publisher of the Washington Informer, which serves the DC Black community, and she doubles as chair of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, which is a trade association of more than 200 African-American owned community papers. And Elizabeth Hansen and Mark Hand have co-authored an idea called the National Trust for Local News. Elizabeth is the lead researcher for news sustainability and business models at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. And her collaborator is Mark Hand, who is CEO of Public Media Venture Group, and he doubles as the Chief Strategy Officer of Public Media Group, which focuses on broadcast infrastructure. So with that, speed reading, let's start with Steve and hear from him.
Well, thank you so much, Jody, and thanks to the center, and congratulations on your debut, and for giving this topic some attention. One general caveat is that this is not intended to be a comprehensive plan to save local news. We all have various ideas on different parts of this, but this is intended to focus a spotlight on one part of the discussion that we all feel has been neglected, which has to do with the financing of local news. So I'm going to do a couple of slides here just to kind of lay out the basics. Okay, so you all are pretty familiar with what's going on out there, and we're not going to belabor the point. This isn't mostly about the problem, but just to remind us how severe this is. 60% decline, just as a point of reference, is about the same as the contraction of the coal industry. And we have thousands of communities that are news deserts or ghost newspapers. And this is going to get worse, unfortunately. This was the trend line even before COVID hit. and COVID has just accelerated the decline. So we all are expecting that in the next 6 months, there could be more bankruptcies, more mergers. And so it's really actually quite urgent for us to try to focus on this problem now. And for those of us that have been sort of in this conversation about how to help local news, it's gone through a couple phases. And for a while, it looked like people were just sort of saying it's a disruption and people will figure out a new model. There'll be new technology. There'll be a new phone app that will solve this problem. And that phase is kind of past. I think people are understanding now that this isn't just a kind of a temporary disruption, that there's something more fundamental going on. And mostly the two solutions that have been talked about have been creating new news organizations, especially nonprofit startups, which I strongly believe in, or helping the existing media through subsidies. There have been some ideas in Congress that relate to that. The problem is that, first of all, with the nonprofit startups, they're great. And I, in a different paper, argue that there should be government support and much more philanthropic support to help build up this nonprofit sector. But we should also be realistic about the scale of this. You know, we have 300 great nonprofit startups now. As a point of reference, there's about 19,000 municipal governments and 6,700 newspapers. So, you know, I don't think we can just ignore the 6,700 newspapers. Now, the problem is with a congressional approach of, you know, subsidizing the existing newspapers, is that a lot of them are in ownership structures that make it very hard for them to invest in their communities. More than 1,000 are owned by hedge funds or private equity firms, and they tend to create extra problems for these news organizations because they have a different mindset. They're not focused on building for the long term. They're focused on extracting cash in the short run. And that often takes the form of just cutting costs by laying off staff. This picture is a really vivid illustration of this. The overall picture is of the Denver Post staff in 2013, the year they won the Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of the Aurora shooting. And then the silhouettes, the blacked out figures, represent the people who, from that original staff, who have subsequently been laid off. Now keep in mind that during the period that this newsroom was being so decimated, the owner of it was actually making quite a lot of money, $36 million in 2017 to be exact. So there is a business model that the private equity firms have that actually works for them, where they can extract real cash from the business. And the problem is that these staff cuts, in addition to, in the short run, hurting the community, also make it very difficult for these news organizations to invest in what would be a future-facing model. That could mean investing in digital subscriptions, in events, in philanthropy. So it has long-term effects as well as the short-term effects. And we want to be honest, like, we're not saying that the whole problem with the local news is ownership by hedge funds. In fact, the business model issues really predate the arrival of the hedge funds and private equity firms in buying these. But what those ownership structures have done is made it very difficult for news organizations to solve their problems. So with that in mind, with the idea that we have these 6,700 newspapers out there, that there should be a new part of the conversation that has to do with replanting these newspapers, transferring the local newspapers to nonprofits or mission-driven for-profits. So I'm gonna just, in the course of this, I'm just gonna horribly torture this gardening metaphor, but it kind of works. So the idea here is that if we're looking at this strategy, you'd think of it as there being the plant, the soil, and the fertilizer. The plant being the newspapers, the soil being the communities, and the fertilizer being a variety of things that we would need to do to help it succeed. And then in the course of talking about this, there's really two pieces. There's the creation of a nonprofit organization, a fund that would do this. And there's several public policy changes that would be either needed or very valuable that could help this happen. And the heart of this is essentially trying to get chains to donate newspapers or sell them for small amounts of money to new entities that are more community-based. That can mean a bunch of different things. It can mean to a new nonprofit. It can mean to a public radio station, an existing nonprofit, community foundation, ESOPs. It could also mean a sale to a public benefit corporation or some other mission-oriented but very community-grounded entity. So let's just break this down a little bit. Such a fund would have a few different functions. One would be to identify the newspapers that might be viable. And we should be honest, a lot of them aren't. A lot of newspapers would not be viable for replanting. You know, it may be that they've been gutted too much, that the quality is gone and they haven't attended to, you know, maintaining a good relationship with their subscribers or their users, or they may just have so many burdens or debts that it would be hard to pull off. The second piece is to help them make a transition. There's a lot of very practical things in this. It's like literally help with legal bills and tax bills, and you know, sometimes representing newspapers in bankruptcy proceedings, or providing templates for how to structure an organization like that. Another potential more elaborate function that an entity like this, a new organization, could perform is potentially buying newspapers or newspaper chains for little or no money, and then breaking them up and reselling the local papers into local communities. So it could have a function of a sort of hold and donate, or hold and plant function for some newspapers. And then finally, they would play a role in helping these to succeed, because getting them into better ownership structures, all that really does is get them to the hard part, where they then have to come up with ways of making these news organizations sustainable. And there's a lot of other elements to that part of it that we have, you know, ideas on how you would do that as well. So breaking this down a little bit more, the newspapers, if you were looking at newspapers for what kinds would be eligible, what would you look for? You'd want to look for signs that, even though they're not currently, you know, necessarily doing spectacularly well, that they have certain elements in place that would make them have a shot. Maybe they have a number of paid subscribers that could turn into digital subscribers. Maybe they have a lot of subscribers to an email list, because that actually is, signs are that email subscribers can convert to digital subscriptions. Maybe they have existing advertisers or revenue streams that are sturdy, that want to stay with it. The brand, the reputation is important. If the newspaper has basically, you know, squandered its reputation and the trust of the community, it may be really hard to build that back. But if they still have that, and sometimes that's been built up over decades, that's worth something. When when you're starting a new thing, one of the things you have to spend a lot of time and money on is building up your audience, building up your brand. So if this newspaper already has brand and audience, that would, you know, be an argument in favor of it. And ultimately, one of the things you'd be looking at is the question of, is it smarter for a community to try to replant an existing newspaper or start something new? Sometimes the answer is going to be start something new. It may be that the newspaper is too far gone, or the cost of transitioning it is so expensive that you're better off putting that money into creating something new. So our assumption is not that of the 6,700 newspapers that all, or frankly even most, would be great targets. But even if it were a small minority, that would mean hundreds and hundreds of communities that would benefit from this. Then there's the question of the communities themselves. There might be situations where there's a newspaper that would fit this, but the community is just not up to taking it on. They may not have community support. There may not be a viable plan and set of leadership that would know how to run this well. They may have a plan that is partisan. In our view, this needs to be nonpartisan, nitty-gritty local reporting. or there may not be a need. There may be others, there's a newspaper, but there might, and it's sad that that's going away, but there's other institutions that are fine, and this just isn't where the priorities should focus. And then the third thing is to focus on the operational support. So once these are replanted, what can this institution, this new entity do to help make sure that they're successful? Shared services is one possibility. One of the reasons, the good reason why newspapers have merged in the past and consolidated is to take some advantage of economies of scale that do actually come from being part of a larger chain. We don't want to deny the reality of some of those benefits. So could this organization actually play a role in providing technology services or shared technology platform or shared legal services or advice on how to do digital subscriptions? Those are all things that could be part of what this organization does. Help with governance. The sad reality is that a lot of nonprofits are not actually well governed and are not governed in a way that is geared toward creating really sustainable business models. So this organization could play a role in strengthening the governance of local nonprofits. And then finally, there's operating capital. And I put this in red because Mark and Elizabeth Hanson are going to elaborate on this. They have a proposal that I think is really exciting, that is like a puzzle piece with this proposal. It helps to fill in a portion here, which is to provide a new way of giving operating capital to local media that doesn't require 20% returns. That is operating capital that is longer, is more patient capital, more public mission focused. So they're going to elaborate on that really important piece of this. Now, why do we think that some of these newspapers can succeed? Well, part of it is that when you think about it, one of the lessons of the fact that you have these hedge funds still wanting to buy these newspapers, or as we said, in the midst of the Denver Post being decimated, the owner was making 17%, I think, profit. So you start with the fact that, what if the local newspaper didn't have to ship off 20% of its revenue off to either a distant owner or to dividends? Just start with that. That's helpful, so that you can have if you're making some money, you can actually invest it in sustainability. So as I said, the problem with some of these ownership structures is not just that it's heartbreaking or that you have less journalism in the short run. It's that it's preventing them from investing in the things that would actually transition it. The third piece is what I call the third revenue stream. The newspapers currently operate around either advertising or subscriptions for the most part, and becoming a nonprofit enables the addition of a third or fourth, third being donations and philanthropy. And by the way, it's also a way of underlying that nonprofits need three revenue streams too. It shouldn't only be donations. They should be looking at earned revenue. And on a kind of more almost spiritual level, the idea is that if you are invested in the community, if the newspaper is literally part of the community in a deeper way, then the community will support it. And if it's not, the community won't. So the last piece of this is that there is a public policy element to this. So far, what I've talked about is, hey, let's create an institution. Let's create a new fund that would do this stuff. But for it to work, it would be better if there were some public policy changes that would make it much more likely to succeed. The most important here is to actually provide tax incentives to chains to donate newspapers or to sell them to public benefit corporations. That can take a lot of different forms. In the paper, we have all sorts of very arcane ways of doing this. One of them is to provide, in a sense, an enhanced charitable deduction, as if the chain is making a gift to the newspaper, but they get a special deduction for it to make it worth it. And the hope would be that if you're an owner and you're looking at shutting down newspapers, that you would think twice about that and think, oh, actually, a better option would be to donate it. Or maybe the deduction is even at the point where it's more appealing than milking the newspaper for a couple of years. You can structure that to offer tax credits for public benefit corporations too. For those of you who don't know what a public benefit corporation is, that's actually a for-profit entity, but it has a mission, and it is, in this case, would be a community mission. And then, and these benefits would not just be available to private equity funds or hedge funds. And in fact, I should just pause and say for a second, while I've talked mostly about hedge funds and private equity funds, this is an issue that's much broader than that. You have all sorts of newspaper chains that have actually been trying to invest in their communities and serve their communities that are struggling. And they may be in a position where they want to sell individual papers, or they want to turn it over. Some family-owned newspapers are at the end of their life cycle, and they would rather invest it in the community than selling it to a chain or shutting it down. The last piece is there generally has to be some government support for local nonprofits. There's a group that I've been involved with called Rebuild Local News, and next week we're going to be putting out a broader proposal on this last point of how to support local news in general. Now, those are the carrots. We also think that there should be some sticks, and that should be a change in the way we think about antitrust policy for newspapers. I used to work at the Federal Communications Commission, and it was always very interesting to me that in the world of broadcasting, there is this concept called localism. And it basically says that in considering all sorts of different public policies, whether it's looking at a merger between two big TV companies or a telecom company, or whether it's looking at ownership rules for news organizations in a community, they have as a value, as a policy principle that's been there since the 1930s, the idea of localism. Does this help the local community? Unfortunately, that value has not been applied to antitrust when it comes to newspaper mergers. And so we're proposing that it should. And the architecture that is already there, the antitrust laws that are already there enable the US Justice Department or the Federal Trade Commission or courts or the FCC already to look at localism as a factor in making antitrust decisions, so that if there were, say, a big newspaper chain that was about to get bought, hypothetically, by a big hedge fund, that it would be appropriate and legal and constitutional for the Justice Department to say, hey, what would be the effect of this merger on the local community? And specifically on the likelihood that local journalism is going to be made locally for the community. So it's not just a matter of competition, it's also about the health of this for the local community. And there's various other things you could do to slow down the process. Like you may remember the plant closing law that was geared to saying, if you're going to lay off a bunch of factory workers, you got to give notice. And that was really geared around making it so that those workers can prepare their own lives. Well, we're suggesting, what if we also had speed bumps that make it so that if a chain is going to close down newspapers in a way that really harms the community, they have to slow down for the purpose of giving some time to the community to organize and potentially try to buy or accept the donation of a newspaper. So those are sort of the public policy elements to this. And the goal with this would be to have several hundred newspapers replanted in the next few years, and to try to get the policy landscape focused on locally grounded newspapers for the purpose of ultimately strengthening democracy in these communities. So you can see the URL for the full report is there, but why don't I stop there and turn it back to Jody so we can get some of these other great panelists in to fill in some of the blanks and add to this.
We're turning right away to Fraser to maybe hear some up close and personal experiences of being replanted.
Yeah, very up close and very personal. Thank you very much. The Salt Lake Tribune is celebrating its 150th year in publication this year, and our first year as a not-for-profit. I think one thing that's really critical is that issue of trust, Steve. And in our state, in the state of Utah, losing what's known as the independent voice would just have tremendous ramifications for public policy, for the kinds of investigative journalism we're known for. And the community really couldn't stand for it. And I think that's one thing that's important to note, is that we did this because we knew that the current business model was failing. We had a owner who was willing to give away an important asset, despite the fact that his brother was running for governor, and there's lots of reasons why you'd want to be able to endorse a candidate if you grew up with him. But I think it's important to think, even though we've had tremendous success and we've raised, several millions of dollars and had a tremendous outpouring of support, that philanthropic funding will not be enough. The state of Utah is a generous place. It's a relatively small state. And politically, not everybody in our state agrees with the work that the Tribune does. So I think if we rely only on philanthropy, we're really not thinking as broadly as what you're suggesting, Steve, and what Mark and Elizabeth are also suggesting. So I really encourage that. I also think that the part of your paper, Steve, where you talk about all the practical elements, this is a heavy lift. I have been spent the last year and a half really knocking down all of the elements that you mentioned. And I'm not a journalist. I come from a nonprofit and philanthropic background. And even with, as many years as I've spent in the nonprofit sector, getting a nonprofit startup is one thing. Transitioning a 150-year-old institution with, dozens of employees and a daily product to a nonprofit was, I think, a little bit more complex than we had anticipated. So as much as can be done to streamline that process, I think would be helpful. The other thing I'd say in closing, it's true that I think that there are many papers for whom this could be a model, that the Salt Lake Tribune could be a model, and the way we did it could be a model. But we are not completely self-sufficient yet. Getting those initial investments, as you put it, Steve, those forward-facing investments, digital, upping our game in all sorts of areas, that occurred, I think, in part because we were first in the market. So we had some very generous gifts from the Knight Foundation, Google News Initiative, et cetera. That money really helped us get to a point where we could do that heavy lift and where we could do those improvements. So with it, as more people come into this market, I don't know how much the Knight Foundation is going to want to give, congratulations to you, you're the first prizes. Maybe there's only one of those and it happened to be us. So I think it's really important to think about the longer term, broader capital stack that we can deploy as we try to save local journalism. We're not a hothouse orchid to kill even more your replanting scenario, Steve, but we are unique because we were first. We're the independent paper in a very red, very monolithic state. And we had a donor who was willing to lose his shirt and lose the power that comes with a paper. How replicable that is across the nation, I don't know. I do know that there's elements that I think hold great promise for us. And I think this capital stack is the missing piece that will really go a long way to seeing how true that model can be for others.
First, I want to thank you for the opportunity to participate on this panel. And Jody, I didn't correct you in the beginning, but I think I should do so now that I am the former chair of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, and but still a very proud member. And for those who don't know, the NNPA, we call ourselves the Black Press of America, and we're an organization of about 200 plus newspapers across the country. Many of us are like the old oak tree in the garden where the flowers are blooming around us. We're just continuing to dig our roots deeper and to try to grow as strong as we can, because those of us, I think, that have been successful over the years have been so because of, and when I say successful, I'm not I'm not saying that, we're making lots of money or growing immensely. It's just that we've been able to sustain ourselves simply because of the fact that a lot of us are family-owned newspapers. I'm a second-generation publisher. Our chair of the NMPA right now is a second-generation publisher. As a matter of fact, most of the NMPA board consists of second-generation publishers. And so, we all say, like so many others, we were born and with blood in our ink in our veins, and that's what keeps us continuing the struggle that we know that particularly the Black press has had for nearly 200 years. I mean, we have never been able to claim those millions. Like I appreciate the fact that Elizabeth talked about with her publication. We've never reached those numbers, and our daily struggle has been really to serve our community. And you talked a little bit about serving the community, and the community will support you. And that's what we've seen, particularly during this period of COVID. And while there are a few of our publications that were originally started as nonprofit publications, I know the Atlanta Voice is one in Atlanta, Georgia, but most of us have been continuing to survive as for-profit publications. But even during this midst of COVID, thanks to the support of our readers, there's been this generosity of giving dollars to our publications, particularly over the past year, recognizing the fact that the donors still don't get that, that tax write-off that they would if we were essentially a nonprofit publication. So I think it's interesting. I really praise this effort to look at alternative ways in which newspapers can be sustainable in communities all across this country. We know that we have to be sustainable because we recognize the need for diverse voices in the conversations about America, past, present, and future. And so we are, and I have to go back a little bit, Steve. I don't know if you were there when I was there, but I did work for a couple of months as an intern at the Federal Communications Commission in the Broadcast Bureau, and said, I don't like a government entity that has the power to really put you out of business. The radio division of the Broadcast Bureau, and part of my job was to figure out what these stations were doing illegally so that their licenses could be snatched. I didn't want to be in that position. So I came on back here with my dad and said, I'll be poor for the rest of my life so that I can continue to help to get the word out to our community and to keep our communities informed. But I know that we are looking at what alternative ways of sustaining ourselves are available. And I think this report gives us something to look at and to analyze and to see how it fits within our conversation. And we've looked at so many different ways to figure out how we are going to sustain our publications, and we're still dependent on advertising. And I like the screen that you had there where we thought, technology was going to be the answer. And it's kind of almost been the bane in our sides, but, we're still working with it. So, I'm going to end there and just say that every day I see new publications coming up, particularly in a city like Washington, D.C., where I am, and all across the country, regardless of what the strain may be. People are continuing to plant media in different places, and they're looking at these alternatives. And I think this product is going to be very helpful.
Wow, that's quite an endorsement.
I'll go ahead. Well, thank you, Jody, and thanks to the other panelists, and thanks to Steve for convening this discussion. When Steve's paper hit my inbox, a month ago, I read it and was so excited to see that we had been thinking along similar lines. I want to share a bit about our National Trust for Local News concept. And just to build on what Fraser said, we really see this as building out the capital stack. So we all know that there's been a huge rush of interest, and thanks to the American Journalism Project, philanthropic dollars flowing into the space. But we also know that, you know, there's been a huge increase in social impact investing. There's something like $500 billion globally right now of capital that is looking for projects to invest in that will tackle major social and environmental challenges. And this collapse of local news is absolutely fits right in that category of a social challenge. So what we imagine that the trust would do is support the acquisition and transformation of papers, like Steve is talking about, from commercial assets into civic institutions through social impact financing, change management, and this mix of local governance and local support. So to introduce yet another analogy into the mix, we see this as a kind of nature conservancy or trust for public land model, where we would be identifying civic resources that might otherwise be dismantled or depleted, and building a federated system that would have a national piece, but also local chapters that could really work together to remake these institutions for I think their civic purpose, the civic purpose that they are actually fulfilling in many cases. So it's important to say that, you know, this is not, just to underline, this is not philanthropy that we're talking about, and it's not equity financing. So, you know, venture investments and venture returns and models like private equity operate on a really intense and onerous set of assumptions around profit and returns. But there is actually another model of capital that's out there that we can mobilize in this space for acquisitions, absolutely, where acquisitions make sense, and also for what we know to be the capital investments that are necessary for the kinds of transformation that we're taking, that need to take place. I like so resonate with my organizational behavior scholar head on with what Fraser said about what it takes to really change an institution. It takes absolutely leadership and staff, but it also takes resources. And right now, we know that there just is not that source of transformational capital, unless you want to go knock on the doors of every single foundation who, you know, are themselves the subject of more requests than they could possibly fill. So the trust is really designed to solve that problem and to take advantage of instruments like tax-exempt bond financing that have fixed returns and very low rates, so that we're not saddling papers with onerous requirements for getting the money they need to transform their business models and transform their operations. So I think just to like put one more plug in for why I think this is so important, and this builds on a question that Nikki Usher asked in the comments. It's absolutely true that philanthropy and big philanthropy in certain communities has a sort of liberal bias and liberal bent, and there can be like a perception that like those are big outsiders that are coming in and telling us what to do. I think one way to get out of that is to actually grow the pie of funds that are available and grow the set of stakeholders that are putting resources into this space, so that we can really truly say that these are like community owned assets, and it's not a single funder, it's not a single foundation, it's not a single major donor, it's not even, you know, a single like state entity, that these are really, you know, these are really governed and funded in a diverse and multidimensional way. And that will also help, I think, with the editorial independence issues. So there's much more to say on the trust and how we imagine the model working, but I wanted to just highlight the capital stack piece of it because I think it's so important, and happy to take questions.
And just one other background that I'll add, and this really comes from the 20-year experience that I had with Public Media Company, which was a national nonprofit that I co-founded 20 or so years ago. And public radio was facing the same kind of issue where a majority of the public radio stations were owned by colleges and universities. And they found that there was a market value to those, and so they decided to start selling them. So what we wanted to do was assemble really a capital structure that would work for helping local community groups or local public stations buy other public stations to really preserve those as local public media entities. So it really worked well, and it was a combination of, as Elizabeth said, tax-exempt bond financing, foundation support. We set up a revolving loan fund with the Ford Foundation and Calvert and other individual investors in that. So it's assembling all the components of capital that were needed to be able to help local stations buy another local station so that they could preserve that. So it really was that acknowledging that capital really works on a national level, and most of the local entities didn't have the capacity when something came up quickly for sale to really be able to jump in and do that. So we're really trying to apply that same model to a lot of the issues impacting newspapers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to make just one more important point before we dive into the discussion, and that's that, private equity and private capital obviously sees huge opportunity in the local news space and are continuing to, spot deals and snap up papers. But what we're also seeing is that this kind of new breed of pink slime news network, places like Metric Media, that can take advantage of the brand equity and reach that local papers have and their real financial struggle. We're starting to see those networks purchase some of these papers and turn them into, algorithmically generated content farms in the kind of best case scenario, and in the worst case scenario, pumping out really politicized content that's kind of feeding the misinformation that we're seeing that's so prevalent on social media. So I think that's the other really important piece to keep in mind in terms of what we're solving for, and kind of who's on the other side of some of these transactions.
Okay, well, I think it's time we go to some questions here. They're starting to pile up. So let's start with Chris Ullman, who asks about whether it's wealthy owners or capitalists. How would a community ensure that these news nonprofits work without editorial interference? Steve, your paper addressed that a little bit.
Well, it's, that's in the nature of the bylaws of the organization. That's just part of what you stipulate as part of the organization. If you're a new nonprofit, you put that in as part of your tax-exempt status. And I think this institution also could help safeguard that by having a seat on the board that is looking out for that particular mission. And it just shouldn't, I would say that if we're brokering, arrangements, that you just shouldn't replant into a news organization that isn't willing to make that commitment and isn't willing to have that as part of their DNA.
Steve, if I could just point out that nonprofits have certainly grappled with this issue their whole history. You don't see donors to the Children's Hospital doing surgery or leading the orchestra if they give to the, to the orchestra. I mean, this is not something that is outside of the way nonprofits operate generally, and there's a long history and a very clear set of guidance around the difference between governance and operations. And so I don't think that it's not as big a leap as you might assume, but what is really important and is perhaps different is the amount of transparency that would be required about who those donors are, who's on the board, making sure there's no self-dealing. All of those things have to be much more, I think, publicly accountable than the traditional model. Nobody thinks that because you give to the ballet, you're going to be up there in a tutu. We just don't think that. But there is that assumption about news. We need to get off on the right foot around this.
And if I could just add to that, Mark and I have done much work in public media, and public media newsrooms absolutely face this issue. And for many of them, it's not just a donor transparency issue, it's also that their licenses are held by universities, and sometimes there can be some fuzz between the rules that apply as part of being a university licensee and what you would expect of a fully independent newsroom. And so there's been a whole set of policies in place in public media and a whole movement especially amongst institutional licensees, to ensure editorial independence. So there are models in other spaces for managing the conflict.
And Elizabeth, that relates to corporate sponsorships as well. So yes.
We have a very interesting question, excuse me, from Julia Reynolds, who wants to maybe hear a little bit more about the carrots, Steve, and how the private equity and hedge funds might get out of the way so community journalism could be fortified.
Yeah, well, Julia and also Tony Daly had a similar question, which is basically, why are you giving tax benefits to the organizations that have caused so much damage? And, it's a totally fair question. And I think for one thing, I personally would be fine with having some incentives if it created a permanent solution, if you basically are grounding these institutions in the communities, that the cost of that compared to the benefits to society seems very well worth doing. But we're totally open to the idea that there might be other ways of kind of extracting these newspapers. I think Tony was talking about something, just essentially pass a law that breaks them up, that basically says that you can't have private equity firms owning more than a certain number of newspapers. I'll let him elaborate on that. But I think that the other thing to keep in mind, so part of my argument for having tax benefits is practical. It's just, I think that's how it would best work. That's the most likely way to get these things in the right hands. But the other part of it has to do with what we've talked about before, is that the private equity firms are not the only players here. There are lots of, when you think about the family-owned newspaper chains that they have not been extracting profits and sending them off, to a hedge fund. They've actually been trying to make it work. And this provides a way for small chains, family-owned chains, to have an exit that they would feel very proud of and happy with, which is to plant it back in the community that they've been trying to serve all along. So for that reason, I like the idea of having some carrots that are real carrots in addition to the sticks.
We hope to have an invigorated debate on this topic and any others. We can't solve all journalism in 60 minutes as best as we'd like. But Mark Henderson asks about how would we really enlist local owners? And I'm interested, we all know how hard it is to rely on a core of volunteers versus, I'd like to figure out a way to have the displaced journalists accept the responsibility and the opportunity to reinvigorate these publications so they don't have to retire, so to speak.
Well, I think that when we talk about the community taking ownership of a publication, that can mean a lot of different things. It can mean literally in financial terms, but in a lot of cases, when you've seen a lot of these nonprofits get formed, it's often journalists from those news organizations that have essentially tried to do it. And it's because they're committed to the mission. And so I think that a successful replanting, or a successful startup for that matter, will be better likely to succeed if they have the support of great journalists in the community as well as civic leaders.
Yeah, I think there's some real innovation to be done in local governance, and I think we've learned a lot from our work in public media about federated systems and how you can have distributed local governance and, like NPR is a member governed organization. There are certainly all kinds of challenges with aligning incentives, but it can be done. And I think what's been surprising to me in studying the startup nonprofit local news space is that a lot of that learning around building local governance and building local support has not actually taken place. And so there's a lot of work to be done, I think, on all fronts to figure out what a closer relationship looks like between local news organizations and their communities.
We have one question here from Daniel Hanley of OMI, who's curious about what might happen to postal policy to help newspapers.
Postal policy used to be a big factor in all this. If you go back, way back to the founding fathers, the postal subsidy was massive and really helped create the modern, or not the modern newspaper industry, the colonial newspaper industry. Right now, it's much less of a significant factor, except for weeklies. And for them, you know, they used to have free subsidized postage, and now it's not subsidized. So I don't know that that would be transformative, to be honest, but it's definitely, as we're looking at different pieces of the puzzle, that makes sense. We did it before, you know, Benjamin Franklin thought it was a good idea, and George Washington did too. So I don't see why we shouldn't consider that again.
I like to evoke George Washington. That always helps. Chris Martin asks, he's one of our CJL scholars, also providing a paper, who's written a lot about postal enhancements. Does this work as well for similar newspapers that are already struggling and privately owned? That is there a margin for success if there is no private equity premium to retain locally?
Yeah, I mean, so the point of the trust is that we would be an off-ramp for struggling local owners who wanted to get some of their investment back, and we would negotiate better terms, essentially. And I think for owners that actually, for whom like local governance and support and mission alignment were an important thing, you know, that I think that could be attractive. So the business model that the trust would be envisioning is not like, we're going to acquire your paper and put it under the expectation of 20% returns. It's like, here's what we think sustainability looks like for you, and here's the financing such that, you know, you pay 2% back of the acquisition cost, you know, amortized over 30 years or whatever we decide. So so it would be both a business model that we could agree on is sustainable, and a financing structure that gives an off-ramp, but also, you know, doesn't overload the organization financially.
You know, Elizabeth, you know, I've gotten many calls from papers around the country as we launched, and I think one of the consistent conversations has been with these family-owned or smaller newspapers where there's a legacy, you know, desire to keep it going, but not necessarily inheriting, you know, you inherit the newspaper, but also the whole headache of it and the financing of it. Out west, we see that a lot with public lands, where you have a ranch owner in Jackson, Wyoming, whose land is worth more than they could ever pay the taxes on. So those sort of easements, I mean, there's a lot of creative thinking that's going on with these legacy transfers, where the wealth and the family and the, you know, the whole you know, just the world is tied up in I own this land, I own this paper.
Yeah.
My family owns this paper. How can we retain that in the same way that we want to retain our open spaces and our natural heritage? So I think some of your thinking here is, it's exciting to see it applied to something else that we can consider a national trust, a national heritage.
Yeah, absolutely. And for some, you know, I would imagine that for some of these papers, there's pieces of that legacy that you want to retain. And then there's other pieces where it's like, well, we actually didn't have the capital to invest in like a new CMS, and we actually haven't quite figured out the digital publishing. And that's where, you know, a trust model that has some of that expertise in-house and has access to those resources can provide a leg up on that kind of transformational piece while preserving the legacy and the importance of the institution civically.
Right, in the same way that when you want to do a land easement, it's not like the rancher themselves does the legal work.
Right.
Folks come in and they help you walk through this and set up a bunch of different alternatives so that you can pick the one that's best for your community's needs.
Yeah, you know, today our comments have talked about the need for the financial stack, a tech stack, and then there's this service stack, you know, of service to a community. It makes me think about a need to figure out how to knit them all together so that all of these likely properties could perhaps actually be more agile in stepping forward, because these are sizable challenges. And I'm wondering if the panel can talk a little bit about how we could get past this talking about stage, and how could we make this into a national movement?
Well, this idea that I've put out there and the idea that Mark and Elizabeth have put out there and merge them They fit very well together. They each kind of attempt to solve a different piece of the problem. Then a handful of billionaires should give this new fund a few $1 billion, I guess. That's the business plan. I mean, in all seriousness, I mean, I think we didn't really try to address like where the capital for something like this would come from. We first wanted to make the case for why it's important that we have it, and why it's important that and how it could work, and what the value of it could be. And by the way, as I said at the very beginning, we're not at all discounting the role of startups in this. We focused in this particular session about this piece that we felt had been neglected, which is are there good things that can be done with the existing 6,700 institutions? But the same notions of what you have to do to make something successful, and the idea of having a better financial stack, and the trust, and to have some of the other things in this paper, a lot of those also apply to startups. The startups, there are already people like the American Journalism Project and the Knight Foundation that have been thinking about that and working on it. And that is the main reason we're not focused on that. It's not that that's not important. That absolutely is a key part of this as well. And I think that if you created something like this, trust, I actually like the word trust better than the word replanting fund, that it could do both. You could have, you can provide the sorts of skills, I like the way you put it, Jody, there's this sort of advice stack, tech stack, and financial stack. And the financial stack is the part that has been least discussed, I think, until today. That is really an important part of it. But they work together, and they don't only apply to newspapers owned by hedge funds.
I would say to your question about the movement building, I think what's been so exciting is to see communities mobilizing around their local papers. Like we're seeing that now in Baltimore. And so when I see that, I think like we have to do this trust like tomorrow, because we could be the entity that could step in and say, we will help you organize, we will put the deal together, we will like provide you everything you need, to swing all the way through on this. And without that kind of, national organizing umbrella and resources, I think these are going to continue to kind of be one-off campaigns.
That's a really...
And that's unfortunate, because the moment is now for sure.
Yeah,
well,
it could get really bad really fast.
Yeah.
And while we may not be able to do that today or tomorrow, we will make significant headway, I'm told, on October 13th.
Yes.
Elizabeth, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we are going to host round 2 of this discussion. We'll dive into the News Trust proposal and invite Steve on, and we'll be able to continue this discussion. I'm like blown away by all the thoughtful questions that we haven't been able to answer in the Q&A. So we will be cross-promoting that. So you'll see it Shorenstein Center, October 13th at 12:30 p.m. And let's all come back together and keep this discussion going.
And send emails to me. I can pass to the discussants, although I'm sure you could also dig up any of their emails. We all look forward to keeping this not one of those post and finish kind of conversations. It has to keep going. We have to keep it accelerated and amplified. So today was the first step. I'm glad everyone who is here has stayed with us. The recording will be available soon, and we will take a look at the comments to perhaps address in the October 13th session. I'd like to thank the panelists for all coming and sharing their day with us, their insights. But there's going to be more ahead. So thanks in advance for all you do for journalism, and thanks everyone for tuning in today.